2010s, researchers from Fuller Theological Seminary asked incoming college freshmen what it meant to be Christian. More than 35% gave an answer that didn't mention Jesus at all. It's consistent with what Princeton's Kenda Creasy-Dean's research says, that the faith of most Christian youth is really a moralistic, therapeutic deism. That God wants them to be nice and good, that the goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself, and that God exists pretty much only to help us with our individual problems. This has been consistent with my own experience in youth ministry and often in ministry itself, and probably in human history and in my own life. Religion is so much easier if it establishes a clear pattern of behavior. When true righteousness is established because I followed the rules all by myself. It's so much easier if we can assume that bad things happen to bad people because they didn't follow the rules, and that our fortune has been so touched because we have been so good. But the gospel acknowledges that life simply doesn't work that way. That God demands goodness from us, but it isn't a simple series of check boxes or sparkly report cards. The righteousness God demands from us is following Jesus to the cross, entering into the messiness of life, not for the sake of our own righteousness, but to uphold the dignity of others. Now, Naomi, you may remember from last week, Naomi, who had fled Bethlehem with her husband and children during a famine, returns to Bethlehem widowed and baby lost, accompanied by her Moabite daughter-in-law, Ruth. Naomi doesn't have a lot of confidence that this return will change her station in life. She is completely destitute. She has few options. She has hit the rock bottom of grief and hardship that exists beyond redemption. There's nothing to be done. Naomi and Ruth could find a Gael, that's the Hebrew word, a kinsman redeemer. But Naomi is too old to marry, and who among the men of Bethlehem would marry Ruth? Not just an outsider, but a Moabite. There wasn't a negative stereotype you couldn't apply to a Moabite. Yet when Ruth went out to glean a few heads of barley for them to eat, she caught the eye of Boaz, Naomi's husband's cousin. And as we heard last week, the two widows cooked up a strategy to confront him and ask him to do the truly righteous thing. And he did. He confronted the man who should have already redeemed them, the closest relative, who admits that there's only risk for him should he take Ruth and Naomi under his wing. And so he waives his right to redeem, and Boaz takes up the mantle. The story ends happily. A son is born to inherit the little that belonged to Naomi's husband and the great love among Naomi and Ruth and Boaz. But before anyone writes this off as a sappy Hallmarky tale, the book tells us that this child will become the grandfather of Israel's most beloved king, David. It's a sign of divine favor, a cue that what has transpired during the Bethlehem barley harvest that year is a glimmer into what God is like. It is a story about what it means to truly follow God's law, what it is that God demands of those who claim to love God. You can see that when Boaz leaves the edges of his field for outsiders to glean. And you can see it in the conversation between Boaz and the other kinsmen about their responsibility to these widows. These are significant parts of God's law. But there's an edge to this story. It's constantly pushing the limits of our understanding and asking us uncomfortable questions. But what if the outsider who gleans your field or who needs redeemed isn't someone from another Israelite tribe, but from another ethnic group? And what if they're going to be back every single day, gleaning barley, then wheat, then amaranth, never ever farming a field of their own, always dependent on what they can glean from others? Feels a bit like seeing the same person on the street corner or having the same neighbor always calling you for help. Too often we expect our meager handouts and leftovers to be the life-changing difference for someone living so below a minimum of standard of living. We believe that this is following God's rules, that this is being righteous. We believe we've done our part and now it's up to them. Of course, most often we give to those in need with strings attached. You have to get a job, take a drug test, don't ask too often, and be sure you use this gift wisely, even though what you probably need is cash money and dignity to make your own choices both foolish and wise. Of course, most often we also demand righteousness from others, expecting that they have the same ability to follow the rules as we do, that they start out at the same station in life, and that fate has treated them exactly the same. Cole Arthur Riley, who wrote the gut-wrenching This Here Flesh, notes, injustice has survived by cowering behind the guises of morality and ethics. This is also what Jesus is saying this morning. He's not necessarily condemning the Pharisees. That kind of verbal sparring is very on brand for first century Jews. Together, they are doing the important work of testing the boundaries of the law. What Jesus is saying that, well, Peter Choi puts it this way in this month's Christian Century. When choosing between rule following and affirming a person's dignity, it was never a hard choice for Jesus. Morality and righteousness begin, as Choi notes, by emphasizing the primacy of loving ourselves and each other in our moral complexity. Cole Arthur Riley says, true justice is much more interested in protecting and affirming dignity with tangible actions. Whew. It isn't that there are no rules. It is that the rules don't exist to prove that we are righteous. The rules exist to show us where we have come up short in loving God and loving our neighbor. The rules exist to protect our neighbor, to be a part of the untangling of the complexities of their lives. Following the rules in righteousness isn't drawing a line in the sand. It isn't claiming you're either in or out, with us or against us, Christian or condemned. It isn't banning books or banning medical treatment or banning women from the pulpit. Righteousness is saying this life is complicated, but I will go with you. As Ruth said to Naomi when they started on their journey, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. Beloved, this book, Ruth, it tells us that our faith is lived out when we willingly enter the messiness of another's life.